Greetings from the Gulf of Guinea and the Ghana coast, aka the Gold Coast. We're in the modern state of Ghana, which was the epicenter of three things that I want to chat about real quick while we're here, and that is stuff, a scramble, and slaves. Because we're at the Cape Coast Castle. You can pan around real quick. The Cape Coast Castle and Dungeon. Why would there be a dungeon? This is a place that was built up by the British and actually built up by the Swedes before them, and actually at times in between controlled by the Dutch or who else? Not the Belgians, not the Flemish. Some other folks have been contesting these territories way back in the day. So what am I talking about? With stuff, with a scramble, and with slaves, all dealing with the Guinea coast here in Ghana. This is a crucial geographic point for all three of these things in Europe's quest to world domination. Because here's the deal. And by the way, this quest for world domination not only affected all of Africa, but of course affected the New World and all points abroad, where the colonies that they took over from Asia all the way to North and South America. But what about this place? Why is this place such a geographic, magical center of things? Because way back in the day, 1,000 years ago, Europe was a backwater. They were in the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. There was nothing going on there. There were other empires in other places in the Middle East, even here in Africa, and of course China and other places in Asia. But Europe was a no man's land, not in terms of development and full-on big empires and civilizations. But that all started to change at the age of colonization, the kickoff of the Europeans becoming world powers by colonial conquest. And it started with the Portuguese. The Portuguese, under this guy, Prince Henry the Navigator. He became a navigator, not so much because he was a good boat person himself, but because he was bored. He was never going to be able to be king. So he funded lots of expeditions for the Portuguese to go start exploring outside of Europe. Exploring where? Exploring the African coast. And indeed, the Portuguese, starting in like 1417, 1418, started to send out expeditions down the African coast to see what's there, to see if there was some rich stuff they could get, some trade centers they could start up in their quest to get around Africa and figure out a way to the rich stuff over in the Indies and in China, Indonesia and India, the spice trade, the silk trade, stuff like that. So the Portuguese were exploring all around this coast, and they got so far as exactly where we're at here by like 1471. In fact, Castle Elmina's right over that way, about 10 miles that way, was the first official Portuguese-built fort slash castle in sub-Saharan Africa. The first European architecture and structure built in sub-Saharan Africa. And that was in 1471. And so the Portuguese controlled all this coast, and that gets me to the stuff. Because once the Portuguese got down here and started bumping around and exploring things, they were seeing, hey, what's here that we want? What's here that we can grab? What's here that we can sell and trade for stuff? And what they quickly found was there was a ton of stuff on this coast. The Gulf of Guinea coast, the Ghanaian coast, the West African coast, exceptionally rich in all sorts of stuff. It had been for a long time. And most of the folks in this part of Africa, in West Africa, would have loaded up that stuff on camel caravans headed that way across the Sahara to trade in Morocco and then other points in the Mediterranean and Europe. So when the Portuguese got around here, they were bypassing everybody. They got to this place, to this coast, and found ivory and gold and grains and pepper. And that's the stuff that they started grabbing up, buying, trading for, and then named the coast for the commodities which they would be extracting from there. Did you ever wonder why this country called the Ivory Coast exists in today's world? Because it was the coast where the Portuguese and others went and got ivory from. And there was a pepper coast up where now modern day Sierra Leone is. And that whole curve around West Africa was a grain coast, rich in all sorts of things. And when you get here to what's now modern day Ghana, they ran into gold. When the first guys got here, they're like, whoa, there was gold dust in the rivers and stuff around here, and lots of the locals had gold to trade. And the Portuguese were like, yay, because everybody loves gold. So they started snapping up all that gold and taking it back home. And then everybody else back home said, hey, we like gold too. Back home by back home, Europe. So European powers heard about all this gold and they're like, we want gold too. So what you had then is the second term, the scramble. The scramble for this place started in haste. I said that Castle Elmina was built in 1471. This one I think was like 1485 was the fort that was built here. Again, we're talking 500 years ago. But in very short order, the Spanish start showing up. The Dutch start showing up. The Danes start showing up. And indeed, the Swedes. The Swedish were the ones that built the first fort in this area. What? Yeah, and indeed, there was even other folks. The Prussians had a piece of this. The Russians had a piece of this. Even those Northern European powers were sending ships out here because everybody wants gold. And so all these European powers very quickly were competing for territory, for land, and for influence on the Ghana coast, on the West African coast. You can go back in the day, and again, it was called the Gold Coast because this is where you got the gold. So there was a Prussian Gold Coast, and a Russian Gold Coast, and a Danish Gold Coast, and a Dutch Gold Coast, and eventually over time, they were all fighting each other, and they all built fortresses, which became kind of castles with dungeons underneath, coming back to that in a second, because they were trying to claim out territory while they were fighting each other. And all these places were switching hands as one European power got the upper hand and took over. So this is a Swedish place that then got taken over by the Danes, and then the Danes got beat by the Dutch, and the Dutch eventually got beat by the British. And that's how this ended up as a big British castle, because they're the ones that built it up even bigger. And that scramble for the Guinea coast is symbolic of what will become the scramble for all of Africa. And quite frankly, for the whole rest of the world. And it really started here. Remember, we're talking like 1470, 1480, 1500, 500 years ago, the scramble started here on this coast over all that rich stuff that they all wanted. So there's stuff, there's the scramble. What do I have left? Slaves. Because I said that this fortress slash castle and the Elmina castle and dungeon over that way have dungeons because once all these European powers got here and were grabbing up the rich stuff and trading for it, they weren't just stealing it, they were trading for it. But they found out, yeah, the Gold Coast has got gold, but they actually have some stuff that's worth even more, and that was humans. And so by 1600 into 1700, 1800, this whole coast, this place I'm sitting in right now, became the historic epicenter of the Atlantic slave trade. And these castles slash forts slash fortresses have dungeons because this is where these, quite frankly, bastards would store humans while they were waiting for the ships to come in off the water to transport them through what we call the Middle Passage, the ship ride over the Atlantic to become slaves in Brazil, right over that way, the Caribbean, right over that way, and indeed, even some in North America, which would become the United States. Something on the order of 10 to 14 million humans were moved from the West African coast to the New World, where, of course, they were in deplorable conditions here in these dungeons we were in today. Very little ventilation, rock floors, forced to live on top of their own feces and human waste with no light, in preparations, essentially, weeding out the weak ones because the weak ones would die in the dungeon, leaving the stronger ones that they knew could survive the horrific Middle Passage on these ships, where they were crammed in, human cattle just smashed in together, elbow to elbow, shackled, to make this horrific 2 or 3 month voyage under deplorable human conditions, of which half of them died on the way there. It all started here on this coast. From the turnaround of the west coast of Africa and what's now Liberia, through this epicenter in here, what's Ghana, all the way around the Bight of Benin, all the way to Angola, were these epicenters of the slave trade. Who was providing these slaves? Mostly fighting tribes in the interior would take hostages in a hostile enemy tribe they were fighting. If they won, they would capture them and come sell them to the British, the Danes, the Dutch, the Portuguese for transport to the New World. Again, in total, on average, they say 12 million human beings moved from this whole western coast of Africa to the New World. Most of them ended up in Brazil. Maybe say 4 or 5 million humans ended up in Brazil from West Africa. Probably another 4 or 5 million in the Caribbean, and less than about 500,000 actually in what's currently the United States. So that was the situation We're here at the historic epicenter of what's going on, and the celebration you hear in the background, by the way, is that Ghana is playing Egypt in, is it World Cup soccer? Is it World Cup time already? It's a soccer match. And so Ghana must have just scored. And that is kind of where we're going with all this. To wrap up, the epicenter of stuff the Europeans wanted as they were rising to power in 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, going out and exploring the world and grabbing up the pieces that they wanted. This was a coast rich in stuff, originally spices, pepper, grain, and gold, but very quickly became known as the slave coast because the stuff they then wanted were human capital to be moved to the New World. And think about how all that 12 million West Africans moved to the New World has affected the times and life and culture of Brazil, of Argentina, of Jamaica, of Barbados, and of course of the United States. This is a awesome, powerful scene, and we've seen awesome, powerful stuff. And I highly recommend everybody come here to get back in touch with the evolution of American society. And by American, I mean North American, South America, and all the America in between. American society is partly West African society, and it all started here in the epicenter, the Ghana coast. Previously the Gold Coast, now the independent state of Ghana. But for now, party on.